They say no one truly knows the vastness of Yellowstone's wilderness, the dense forest, yawning valleys, and isolated caves that pock the landscape like secrets waiting to be unearthed. I learned just how deep those secrets ran when I received the call. It changed everything. Ranger Coton. The voice on the other end of the line crackled, barely audible over the static. We need you at the base camp immediately. Bring all available units. The urgency in Chief Mason's voice was unmistakable. My gut twisted with an unspoken dread as I clicked off the radio and glanced at the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in shadows. By the time I reached the base camp, the air was thick with tension. Park rangers and search and rescue personnel huddled in clusters, their faces pale beneath the glow of floodlights. Chief Mason, a veteran with steely eyes and a voice that usually cut through any panic, looked shaken. "What happened?" I asked, stepping into the circle of worried faces. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "We found bodies. Colton, 52 to be exact, all deep inside the cave at Raven's Hollow." Raven's Hollow was a place whispered about among rangers, a labyrinthine cave system. Its entrance was marked by a jagged rock formation that seemed to sneer at those who dared to enter. Stories of missing hikers and strange echoes had turned it into a local legend, a place parents warned their children about when they told campfire tales. But this was no tale. This was real. We moved in a somber line, flashlights sweeping over the jagged walls as we descended into the old main chamber of the cave. The air smelled stale, heavy, something that made the hair on my arms prickle. Specialist Danvers, a ranger known for his steady nerves, muttered a low curse when our lights flickered. The deeper we went, the more the beams seemed to be swallowed by the dark. "Colton, over here." Raya's voice came from up ahead, echoing strangely in the confined space. When I reached him, the beam of my flashlight fell on what he had found. A torn boot, half buried in a mound of dirt, the leather still dark and damp. The main chamber opened up suddenly, a vast cathedral carved by nature, with stalactites like jagged teeth overhead. But it wasn't the rock formations that held my attention. It was the bodies. They were laid out in a pattern almost ritualistic, their hollow eye sockets gaping as if they were screaming in silent horror. Some were the shredded remains of hiking gear. Others were little more than bones, picked clean. The smell of decay and something metallic filled the air, making my head swim. "Dear God," someone whispered behind me. Danvers moved closer, holding his flashlight over the remains of a child. The small skeleton curled into itself, as if trying to block out some unspeakable terror. I fought the bow that rose in my throat. "We need to get out of here," Rhea said, his voice tight. But before we could turn back, a deep resonant hum vibrated through the chamber. The wall seemed to shudder, and a cold breeze swept through, carrying with it a sound that chilled me to my core, a whisper that echoed our every breath. "Welcome." Panic set in, the raw and primal fear that gripped us all. The flickering lights cast dancing shadows on the walls, but these shadows didn't behave as they should. They slithered, coalescing into shapes that were almost human but wrong. Too thin, limbs elongated and jointed in places that defied nature. Danvers screamed as one of the shapes lunged, its inky blackness enveloping him before he could react. His flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam spinning wildly and casting grotesque shapes across the chamber. "Move." Mason's voice cracked like a whip, snapping us out of our shock. We stumbled back toward the narrow tunnel. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of mocking voices that spoke in a language I didn't recognize. Rhea's hand gripped my arm, his eyes wide with terror as we pushed through the suffocating dark. But the cave wasn't done with us. The exit we had come through moments before now seemed miles away, as if the cave itself had shifted. It became meaningless as we ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, the walls seeming to close in, the air growing colder with each step. Rhea stumbled, and when I turned to help him up, my flashlight fell on something carved into the stone. Symbols that resembled eyes, hundreds of them. each one watching. "Keep going." Mason's voice was hoarse, but I could hear the exhaustion, the hopelessness. Then the whispering stopped, replaced by silence, so profound it rang in my ears. The shadows receded, melting into the darkness as suddenly as they'd appeared. We burst into the open air, collapsing onto the frostbitten ground outside. For a moment, none of us spoke. The bodies were real, the shadows were real, but we all knew the truth would never leave that cave. It couldn't. Some things were better left in the dark, where no one would dare to look. "Seal it," Mason finally said, his eyes haunted. And we did, rolling boulders until the entrance was hidden. A secret swallowed once more by the earth. A couple of years ago, I was backpacking along the Appalachian Trail with my brother during the off-season, when the trail is far less busy. We were somewhere along the Tennessee and North Carolina border in the Great Smoky Mountains. It was around 3:00 p.m., and we were pretty worn out from hiking all day. Upon turning on a switchback, we saw a blue tarp covering a couple of meters off the trail. Sticking out from underneath the tarp were 2 feet of old, torn-up running shoes with blue jeans leading to a body-sized mound. At first, we thought it was most likely a dead body, but it was strange that it was right next to the trail. We waited for a second and looked closely, and saw the tarp slightly rising and falling as if the body was breathing. I asked something along the lines of, "Sister, are you okay?" to see if the body needed help or was injured. No response. We did not want to pull back the tarp because it was completely covering the mound, and I think the corners or edges were tucked under the body. No face or breathing space, just 2 feet sticking out. We ended up taking note of where it was and continued hiking. A mile or so later, we were stopped on the side of the trail having water and a snack, and we heard the sound of someone walking behind us. But the sound stopped, and we continued hiking. I thought I could see another hiker maybe 100 meters behind us as we continued, but they always hung back far enough to avoid being seen. At the next trail fork, we stopped again for water and to consult our map, looking for where to turn for a shelter. We saw a hiker wearing the same blue jeans and torn running shoes approach. He was carrying a massive green body bag over his shoulder, a plastic gallon of water, and a ripped-up red shirt. As he got closer, I could see that his hair was super patchy, his face and teeth kind of mangled, and his eyes looking pretty strung out. He asked us which way we were headed, which is usually common practice to warn other hikers of water outages, bear warnings, close shelters, etc. Other times, hikers will make conversation, saying, "Oh, where did you start hiking, and what's your final destination?" When we asked him, he said he did not have a specific destination but was just headed the same way as us and enjoying the hike. We said, "Cool," and wished him a nice day, then continued on our way. When leaving, I looked down and saw that he had a leather sheath hanging on his belt with a couple of large kitchen knives sticking out. He continued to follow behind us, staying just out of view. He strolled past us a couple of times when we had stopped for water, but we would never pass him, meaning he was hiding off the trail for us to pass. Again, we ended up hustling and hiking at a really fast pace, well into the evening, to try and put some distance between us and him and hopefully shake his trail. We continued to the shelter we were planning on sleeping at that night to avoid him. Fortunately, there was another duo of backpackers at the shelter we ended at, and we warned them of his behavior. None of us slept very well at night, listening to make sure he was not lurking nearby. Fortunately, we did not see him again. We were guessing he was just a tweaker or someone with serious mental health issues, but he definitely gave off some sketchy serial killer vibes. A few years ago, I met a fascinating man who eventually became a good friend. I'll call him Chris to protect his identity. We both have a military background, so we spoke about some of our exploits in those past lives. He had an unexpectedly haunting story to tell. This took place on an undisclosed military base located in the damp jungles of a remote island. Chris says he remembers the wilderness being unnervingly quiet for at least a week leading up to the incident. The personnel stationed there chalked the silence up to a change in seasons or something. There had been reports of bizarre sightings, fast-moving animals no one could explain. Anyone who mentioned them was typically shut down with ridicule from fellow soldiers. The sightings were notably inconsistent with one another. Some saw large eyes, others saw small ones. Some heard a big thing trudging boisterously through the woods. Others heard the sounds of something small and light sneaking around in the brush. No one had seen anything worth defending in an inevitable argument, let alone losing their reputation. Chris heard every report due to the fact he was the desk sergeant at the time. Anyone who saw or heard something that could potentially impact the security of the base would typically come to him to have it noted in the log. He never took the more fantastical reports seriously enough to actually write them down, unbeknownst to the concerned soldiers who came to him. Some of them came just to talk about what happened off the record. Anyway, this would typically end up with him just trading ghost stories on the night in question. Chris and his team were on the far side of the island, a completely uninhabited area. There was no human presence that could be found for hundreds of miles in every direction. For that reason, the military chose that location for storing their weapons and explosives. Chris and a partner, who I'll call Barry, were conducting the nightly checks on the magazine storage areas, which lay several miles deep into the uninhabited zone. The jungle was still weirdly quiet, but it was good for them, being that their mission was to detect foreign intelligence or operatives tampering with their equipment, or the occasional refugee group that was washing ashore. They were on a road that rested in the valley of two mountains, bordered by gigantic hills, thick and rocky with tall grass. As they drove along slowly with their Humvee windows down, they heard a heavy thud coming from the woods. A totally unexpected, unnatural sound emanated clearly from the tangled growth. The first thud drew their attention, but was quickly followed by other noises. Barry shut off the headlights and turned off the engine so they could sneak up on whoever was out there. They knew anyone attempting to navigate the dense vegetation would have to do so carefully, taking time to avoid injury. But surprisingly, they could hear fast-paced walking rustling through the tall grass. After a few moments, the sound began to move parallel to the road. They restarted the vehicle and started to proceed toward the noise. The walking continued for a while as they followed it with only their running lights on, before suddenly stopping. They at first thought they'd lost track of whatever it was, so they turned the headlights back on, assuming it was a deer or something, and continued a distance down the road. As Barry proceeded to turn the high beams on, both men noticed something in the distance, approximately 30 yards ahead. A humanoid creature jumped into the road and then into the brush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall, with a small oval head. Its movements were too swift for its size. The best way he could describe its leaping motion was like that of an impossibly nimble frog. Seeing the creature instantly gave Chris the feeling of being punched in the stomach. His heart sank so rapidly, and the adrenaline kicked in so fast that he began to feel nauseous, on the verge of vomiting. He lamented the fact that neither of them had the will to chase after the creature, but that the feeling of being at such a disadvantage was absolutely petrifying. The idea that they were stalking it raised the question: were they hunting or being hunted themselves? Whatever it was, the creature definitely had the tactical advantages of position and mobility. Chris and Barry turned their truck around and sped off into the night. The woods remained silent for at least another week, returning to the normal drone sounds of the local wildlife. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, completely rural, in a Tennessee Valley community. My house was surrounded by forests and mountains. When I was about 14, my dad started to hear strange sounds coming from the hills behind our house. Knocking sounds, as if something was hitting a tree, and the occasional inhuman yell. My dog, a rough and tough outside boy, was very drawn to those hills. At random times, his ears would shoot up, and he'd quickly run up to the forest and stay for a while. Him going up in the hills wasn't uncommon, but at the time, he started acting particularly suspicious about them. And don't worry, nothing bad happens to him in this story. Anyways, the noises started to become more frequent. My brother and his friend used to hunt for ginseng up in the hills, and they heard the noises too. Much louder, of course, since they were near the source. One day, the noises wouldn't stop. They progressed louder and louder, and there was growling. My brother was pretty much sick of it by now and wanted to know what was up there. After about a year of wondering, it's evening time, about to get dark, so he takes a flashlight and a shotgun and heads up into the hills. He sees a creature that looks like what he said could be a Sasquatch. It was tall with broad shoulders, wider than its torso. He saw its silhouette because of the darkness that came. Then he chased it off, came back to the house, told me what happened, and drew a sketch of what it looked like. The noises had stopped after that day. They never came back. Oh, and a couple of weeks later, a new Bigfoot special came on TV. A witness sketch of an alleged Bigfoot looked almost identical to the one my brother made. To this day, we're still convinced Bigfoot lived. I have only spoken to a few close friends about this experience, and my parents don't quite believe me. When I was 12 years old, my two younger brothers, my two younger cousins, and I were playing outside at night. Our cousins had come over to visit us, and all the adults were inside the house at the time. We lived in a small trailer park in Texas, which was built either on top of or near indigenous land. We played outside a lot, and there was a streetlight that shone over the part of the road where we were playing, so it didn't feel too creepy. I looked down the road where a white house sat. Next to it was a garage, and next to that was the forest. There was a lot of forest in the area. I saw something coming out of the forest. I thought it was a wolf for a brief moment, but then my heart sank when I saw its distorted, long, thin limbs and the uncanny way it moved, which brought tears to my eyes. It had a long head and a small mouth, like a horse, was tan in color, extremely thin, and had no tail. I grabbed my cousins and told them to look where I was pointing, asking if they could see it too or if I was crazy. They had terrified looks on their faces and said yes. I looked back at the creature and saw it get up and start walking on its two hands and legs, moving in such a freaky way. It began to climb the garage with ease. This thing had to have been around 8 to 10 feet tall while standing on its back legs. I then ordered everyone to run inside. I told the adults what we saw, but they didn't believe us for whatever reason. I assumed they thought it was our imaginations. Anyway, I haven't seen those cousins since the encounter. Due to family issues, I have searched the internet many times, trying to find a sighting report or image that resembles this creature, but I have had no luck. So now I am turning to Reddit. Please let me know if you know anything about what we saw that night, or if you've seen something like. Long story short, I had an experience involving a very aggressive dog running past me with its tail between its legs on March 3. My poor flashlight showed me normal deer walking around, and something about 8 feet tall walking with them on two legs, with deer handlers and face. That place has always given me the creeps, and I'm not a wuss or a pushover. I was a volunteer fireman for over a decade, running into burning buildings for fun. I always loved the woods and outdoors, born and raised in Northeast Georgia, but that holler has always given me the creeps. After that night, never again ever. For what it's worth, that encounter turned me into a flashlight enthusiast. I now have way more money invested in them than is reasonable, and it's the entire reason I bought an Ace Beam 75. If I can't kill it, I can at least blind it, and hopefully get away. We've had plenty of pets go missing down there permanently, including a squat little whiner dog mix. When we finally found him, he was 15 feet up a tree on a limb, whining for days. Jesus Christ, I hate that holler. I could tell plenty of stories about that place, and we've only lived here for about 5 years. When you look from above, there are only maybe 100 yards to a fence line to the next guy's property, but when you're actually in it, it feels like it warped your perception. It took us 20 minutes just to get halfway to that fence. That was the time we had to go look for RJ, the little idiot dog, because I swore for days I heard him whining but could never see him. When my upstairs neighbor, owner of RJ, and I finally went to look, it took us an hour to cover what's basically about an acre of basic woods, not super thick and not hard to traverse. When we got to where I was positive I could hear him right next to me, we couldn't find him for the longest time. He ended up being above me in a tree. That dog could barely jump on the couch, so I have no idea how he ended up that far up a tree. It's not like he could climb. Noah, my upstairs neighbor, had to physically climb the tree and drop him down to me. Both of us decided never to go in there again. So much weird juju in. When I was about 12, me and a load of kids from the neighborhood went to paddle in a lake in the countryside outside our village. I looked to my left and saw a woman standing on the surface of the lake about 20 feet away. The water was about 3 or 4 feet deep, because I checked afterward. She was dressed in long white robes, which covered her hair too. These robes were gleaming white. She was patting her face with some sort of cloth, as though she was crying. She was as real and solid as you and me, not see-through or anything. In extreme shock, I looked away, and when I looked back a second later, she was gone. It turned out that one other girl saw her too. No idea what she was, why she was dressed like that, why she appeared to be crying, or how she could have been standing on the surface of 3-foot deep water. 3 years later, I was passing a wooded garden half a mile from my house. It was the priest's house, very old and in a quiet area. No other houses nearby. About 10 feet away from me, a figure was hanging from a tree. It was a male figure and had his back to me. He was right against the tree trunk, with his arms suspended by his sides. Either he had no head or his head was out of sight. He wore all gray clothes, as though they were from the 70s or 80s. Gray trainers, gray work, and school uniform trousers, a puffy gray jacket. Again, it was a solid apparition, as real as you and me. I stared at it for literally minutes, taking in every detail. It wasn't a trick of the light or anything. There was no apparent way for him to be hanging there, no visible rope or anything, and the fact that I couldn't see any head was really creepy. I ran all the way home and burst into tears. My mom believed me, but there were definitely no acts of self-harm living in the area. It's a tiny rural village in Ireland, and everyone knows everyone there. There have been only 2 acts of self-harm there ever, and they are still talked about. No idea what the hell it was I saw. For those who don't know, the Entas are a national forest about 2 hours east of Salt Lake City. I'll start with the first and most mild experience. I went up with a group of friends to spend the weekend rock climbing and fishing. The event happened on the first evening as we were driving back from our campsite. My buddy suggested that we check out a community art project called the Fairy Garden, located in a massive river drainage system. The drainage created tons of perfectly polished spherical rocks, yet the place had been around long enough that small trees had started to grow up. People would come and paint and decorate the rocks. The whole place had a pretty weird vibe to it. It was very maze-like. My friend and I decided to see how long the place stretched on, so we began to hike out in one direction. The whole place was huge. We must have walked a mile, and we were still seeing these rocks that people had painted and put out. The trees looked much weirder at this point. They were all very thin and arranged in an almost perfect grid. I realized that my friend had wandered off from me, so I began to call out his name. I began to hear somebody calling my name from behind me, but it sounded too distant to tell if it was my friend or not. I turned and began to walk towards the sound when I heard somebody running up to me from behind me again. It was my friend, who had heard me calling and ran over. I was pretty freaked out, but I still think that this could have been me working myself up because I was in the woods. The second experience supports a more obvious and malevolent presence. On the second day, we were fishing after a day of climbing, and I wasn't getting any luck, so I decided to take a loop around the lake with my dog. I got to the other side of the lake, where the land becomes steeper and has some cliffs and boulders around it. My dog freezes, turns to look uphill, and starts whining. My initial guess was a bear, so I told my dog to sit and began to hike uphill. I reached a cliff with a very easy staircase-like feature on it and scrambled over it to see what was above. I was in a boulder field, lots of very cool rock features and stuff. I began to look around and determined that whatever had spooked my dog wasn't nearby. I noticed what looked like a dark figure behind a tree about 30 feet ahead of me, and I quickly freaked out and turned to get back to my friends as I was down climbing the section I had climbed up. I began to hear my name being called again, very distant and not obviously male or female. Suddenly, a bit of rock I was holding on to rips off, sending me on a good 3-foot fall, and then rolled me about 10 feet down a hill. Besides scrapes and bruises, I was okay, so I quickly got up to continue on. I heard my name being called. This time it sounded much louder, and I could feel anger and hostility in the voice. The voices stopped promptly when I got back with my friends. The dog was on edge and jumpy for the rest of the trip, and that was what really made me wonder what was going on. Since my dog is usually never scared of things like this, I definitely think that there is some weird stuff going on in those mountains. I know there are some pretty good explanations for what I've experienced, but it just felt very wrong to me. The fact that whatever entity there is may have caused me to fall while climbing. Utah granite is pretty strong. Even untouched rock wouldn't split off in the way it did. Does anybody have ideas or encounters in these mountains that they think could correlate? I'm a huge Civil War buff. I had a list of battlefields I really wanted to visit in my life, and I had my big four: Gettysburg, Shiloh, Bull Run, and Antietam. Today, I had the chance to visit the last of the four, Antietam. It was quite an amazing experience. I've been an investigator for over a decade and didn't expect to use the things I've learned in that time today. As soon as I got out of the car, you could feel the heaviness of the area. Over 23,000 casualties were suffered in a 12-hour span, at times one soldier dying every second. I went on the auto tour and stopped at the bloody cornfield, the site of probably the majority of the death that occurred there. They were just bodies on top of bodies. At one point, a soldier died about every second. It was one of the dumbest displays of military ever, as column after column tried to advance across the field only to be mowed down. That brings me to today. I came to the cornfield and parked. I went to the volunteer ranger there, and we spoke of what happened. He showed where the lines were and how they moved time after time. As we stood there and looked over the now soybean-planted field, we noticed a man about halfway out stand up and advance quickly towards us to fall and disappear. I asked the ranger how often people made the pilgrimage across the field, and he mentioned that it wasn't often at all. At that point, we walked into the field, into the area, and flanked where the man was. No one was there. The ranger told me that there were an estimated 500 soldiers still left on the field, not even in tomb. He said it wasn't his first experience. A moment later, we heard what sounded like a random cannon shot in the distance. He said he'd probably write that off, but none of the three of us could discount the random soldier that we had just seen attempting to make his final charge into the Confederate line. I checked my photos and couldn't see anything, but I know what I saw. The whole day was a battle inside, not letting myself get overwhelmed by the knowledge of how many lives ended that September day. It was crazy. This took place last year at the beginning of summer. I was with my mom, headed down to my Nana's farm to visit for a weekend. For some context, she lives on a farm way back in the country, right at the foot of a mountain in rural South Carolina. It's a very rural, secluded area, so the roads are badly maintained and barely enough for two cars to pass one another. The houses are also spread out and set far back into the tree line from the road, so there's very little ambient light besides the headlights of a car. So my mom and I are driving along, her in the driver's seat and me as passenger. It was around 11:00 p.m., and we're 15 minutes out from Nana, deep in the woods with the radio down almost to silent. We come onto this straight stretch of the road in a heavy wooded area, and suddenly this blur of a creature darts out across the road, right at the edge of our headlights. It was moving pretty fast, but both me and my mom were able to get a good look at it, and both agree on what we saw. It was a fairly large creature, roughly the size of a person and bigger. Neither of us could make out the head, but we both remember it appearing to have a segmented body. My mom's words. Emaciated, its rib cage poking out. The reflection of light made it hard for me to tell color, but my mom said she remembered it to be dark, and she didn't see fur or hair. It had long limbs, and as it moved across the road, it didn't run the way a dog or horse with all four legs would. The best word to describe it would be loping, using its front limbs to pull itself along, and it was moving considerably fast. We both said something along the lines of, "What the hell is that?" as it crossed in front of us. As we got up to where it had crossed, I turned to look at it just as it reached the other side of the road and out of our headlights, and I swear on my life, it stood up and ran. Not like a dog rearing on its hind legs. It was definitely bipedal. I immediately yelled that it had stood up, and we both started getting nervous. I honestly would have thought I was going insane had I not had another person in the car with me. My mom has always been a pretty level-headed person and not superstitious, but she was very nervous and made me agree to not tell my nana about it to avoid scaring her, which made me recognize how serious this was. I should also mention that there had apparently been a series of attacks on livestock and horses in the area around the time this happened. People were saying they found wire fences ripped through and their animals attacked. I don't think any died, but if I remember correctly, there were a few horses that were severely wounded. There have been a few other strange instances in the area, but that was my personal experience. As I promised, I would tell you guys about the alien experiences my grandfather had. What happened to my grandfather was a series of abductions that happened around circa 1990. He often traveled because he moved away from his family at a young age, so he was always on the road several times a year. On one of these times, he recalls it being early morning before the sun came up. Out of nowhere, he remembers seeing a huge bright light above the tree line, to his left-hand side. It's important to note that he's only an hour out of town at this point, so this bright light was seen, and his first thought was that it's an airplane about to crash or try to crash land on the road. So he sped up to about 80 miles per hour, and this thing was keeping up with him. So he realized it's not a plane. The last thing he remembers is the trees bending and then blacking out. He comes to, and his car was parked on the shoulder of the road 6 hours later with no memory of his lost time. How he knows he lost time is the 7 or 8 missed calls from my work, worried grandmother. My grandpa just chalks it up to being overtired, but later he recalls having felt mentally exhausted after that event. My grandpa would get very nervous, and he would know when they were coming for him. He would even tell my grandmother, "They're coming for me tonight," and he would have anxiety attacks about it all day into the night. The next morning, he would come back with markings that looked like cigarette burns on his heels and behind his ears. The ones behind his ears would often leak a white smelly substance. He remembers being pulled out of his house and floating upward toward a craft that would be sitting above his house late at night. They would then lay him on a metal gurney and begin probing him in various spots on his body. He never saw any of these beings, but he remembers being inside the craft, walking down a hallway with a see-through floor. He remembers being guided by 3 beings, one behind him, and one on each side of him, down this hallway. They were taller than him. He is about 5'10". He remembers the fear he felt and didn't want to look at or engage with these beings, so he kept his vision to the ground or to the front of him. He recalls looking down through this floor and seeing Earth. On one of these occasions, he was taken to the dark side of the moon, where he said he saw towers. The only way he was able to identify the moon was the craters and color of the dirt and dust. These abductions lasted for years, and most he doesn't want to remember because they were very traumatic for him. I can tell you my grandpa is a very caring person and very honest and has no reason to lie about these experiences, and the markings can be confirmed by several people who saw them firsthand. It's amazing that so many people experience nothing, yet some have lived their entire lives with this. My family, for as far back as I can remember, has always had these experiences, sometimes individually, but quite often in pairs or as a group. I used to think all this was normal. That being said, I will share one incident that I have not posted before. I was in my 30s, living in my parents' home with my 2 kids. After my divorce, at the top of the stairs was a small landing area, roughly 8 by 10 feet. My sister and her husband had squatted there in that small space and sectioned it off from the walkway with curtains. This space was just outside my bedroom door, where I was sitting on my bed watching TV and eating spaghetti with the kids. After we had finished eating, I collected the dishes to take to the sink. I exited the room and walked towards the stairs. When I got there, I could see at the bottom that the door to my son's room was open about 2 feet or so. The light was on, but the entrance was hazy, dull, and somewhat dark. The air itself appeared thick, and I could faintly see the motion of it. It was unnerving, to say the least. As I got closer to it, a sense of unease washed over me, and I felt as though someone was lurking in the doorway. When I passed it by, I said, "I don't think so," shut the door, and proceeded to the kitchen. I went back upstairs, closed my door, and sat back down at the foot of my bed. Within seconds, say 15 to 20, someone pounded on my door rapidly 4 times, hard enough to knock a picture off the wall. Naturally, I flew off the bed, only needing to close a gap of about 5 feet. I flung the door open quickly, only to find nothing there. There was no movement from the curtains that divided the area. No dog, just nothing. Slowly, my sister's head pushed through the curtain, and she was visibly spooked. She asked me, "What the hell was that?" Her husband was hurrying to get to rest, and he said, "I don't know, but we're not staying here tonight." Around this time, the sliding glass door in the master bedroom slammed open and shut, followed by the sliding door on the patio. It was my father's preferred means of moving from his room to the main house. He looked up at me angrily and yelled, "Who the hell is pounding on doors?" "I'm trying to sleep." I explained the series of events to him, and he stared briefly at the floor in front of him. "Oh, okay," was all he said before returning to bed. My children, on the other hand, were understandably shaken. As their father, it's my job to provide some form of comfort or reasonable explanation. On this occasion, I was drawing a blank. This incident has come up a few times. My kids have had their own experiences, including that of a shadow figure in that same house. Sometime later, at this point in their lives, it's more about listening than trying to explain. When I was around 8 years old, my biological mother, whom I no longer live with, was into witchcraft. She had a Ouija board, as well as many other things like basil, rosemary, stuff like that. However, the Ouija board is the main object in this story. We had a family friend who came over a lot, and my parents had a few drinks with him and played a few games. Then my parents told me and my 2 sisters to go to bed, as if they were going to watch a scary movie or something. However, it was much, much worse. We were all in bed sleeping. I woke up and was thirsty, but I knew my parents wouldn't have been happy about me being up so late, so I snuck through the hallway and stopped at the turning point of the hallway. I saw my parents and their friends sitting around the coffee table. My mother had a very unsettling look on her face, as did my dad, but their friend had an excited look on his face, like he had just gotten some great news. I never realized what they were doing until I got older and understood they were playing with the Ouija board. Since I hadn't known anything about the paranormal at that time because I was too young, I never realized why I had been seeing the things I had. But now I do. After that experience, I started seeing a very tall, very dark shadow, no coloration other than black, coming to me at night. It probably started around the same time as that night. Every night as I got older, I started seeing it, but not other things. I am now quite a few years older and haven't had an experience with a shadowman again. However, my mind is much more open, and I see and feel things that I don't think everyone sees and feels. A newer story is about me, my dad, my sisters, and my new mom moving into a 4-bedroom trailer. At first, I was still pretty young, but old enough to know about the paranormal. This was around the end of 2023. I had closed my eyes and kind of meditated. I had what felt like a vision of an older woman with blondish hair, a light whitish robe, and a cigarette in her hand. She was sitting in a chair in a living room, the living room in our house. But it was really dark and foggy. She had a small white poodle-type dog. She was just sitting there, and then I opened my eyes. It was weird, but I had things like that happen before, not as clear as that one, but I would have a dream or vision of a moment, and then a few days or weeks later, it would happen. But that's not all. Many unexplainable events have happened in our house, some of which my parents have witnessed with me, and many by themselves. On one occasion, I was home alone watching TV around midday. I got up to use the restroom and was halfway to the doorway when the door slowly creaked closed, as if someone was shutting it. On another occasion, which happened in front of my mom and dad, we were sitting in the kitchen. My mother and father were talking about the security camera we had just installed outside when I heard what sounded like a radio noise. At first it was quiet, then it started blaring channels so loud it sounded like a spirit box. That was when my mother and then my father noticed it. We made our way to their bedroom, which is where the noise seemed to be coming from, but the sound stopped as soon as we all jumped up to go there. My parents never had an old radio, which is what the sound resembled. A couple of days later, my older sister's sound system set an alarm off. However, my sister had been gone at work since about 6 o'clock in the morning, so it was strange, but of course not the strangest thing we've encountered. On another occasion, a black cat and a crow were found dead by me and my little sister. Then a few days later, my black cat Moon passed away. If anyone knows anything about these signs, please let me know what you think. My stepmom says we're cursed, and I'm not too far from that idea either. It's been a few weeks since anything has happened, yet I will keep this updated if any more strange encounters occur. Thank you for listening to my scary story. I hope you enjoyed it. Back in the 80s, my Aunt Kay was in her early 20s. This was before she married my uncle, and when she would drive long distances back and forth between her parents and my uncle's to visit. It was a transitional period for them. He had just graduated, and she hadn't moved up yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states through the desert, which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So Aunt Kay set out and began one of these journeys. A couple hours into the drive, Aunt Kay noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to Les Miserables until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into a rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she said she felt and heard as clear as day, "Don't pull over." Then again stronger, "Don't pull over." Call it God intuition or just a gut feeling, but a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through Aunt Kay's body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself, what the hell was that? As she saw the vehicle peel out behind her, the dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flashing their brights and motioning for her to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning? She felt it would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, especially before cell phones. But she pressed on. Just as her resolve wavered, she started questioning if she truly did feel what she felt. She started slowing back down when the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane, and came level with Aunt Kay's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and yelled the words, "Pull over." Aunt Kay said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach, and again heard the words in her head, "Don't pull over." She described him as looking scary and greasy, and noticed he was missing a couple of teeth in his smile that she'll never forget. That sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thought she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her. She slowed down, he slowed down. She sped up, he sped up. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was to the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her alone out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aunt Kay saw a couple of semis off in the distance. She felt if only she could get close or even get in between those trucks, she would be safe, so she took off. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn, and try to hit her car until she got close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down and eventually disappear from view. She stayed with the trucks for a couple of hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Fast forward several years. My aunt and uncle are married. He's working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. She's now a full-time mom of several young children. Since I've known my aunt, she's been obsessed with true crime. Days in 20 and Unsolved Mysteries were always playing at their house. This day was no different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room. The interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As she paired another match of socks, she heard the man describe one of his tactics for procuring victims. According to him, he would wait along the side of the highway. A car would go by with a family, and he'd wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he'd wait. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty woman driving alone. So he'd pull out behind and follow him. He'd flash his bright honk and motion for them to pull over. Aunt Kay was paralyzed. She continued to listen. When they would eventually pull over, he'd tell them to pop the hood, and he'd be able to tell them what was wrong with their car. They would, and he'd yank a couple of wires when the car wouldn't start. He'd tell them, "No problem, my buddy has a shop in the next town. I can give you a ride, and he'll give you a fair deal." My aunt slowly moved to the living room. They'd get in, and he'd assault and kill them, bury him anywhere in the desert. When I asked how many times he did this, he responded, "They'll never find all the bodies. I can't even count on how many got away, 2 or 3. My aunt stood alone, staring into the same toothless grin she saw on that highway that day. It was Henry Lee Lucas in the early 80s. I walked and hiked a lot in San Bruno Mountain Park, which is just behind San Francisco International Airport. Twice, I saw a large dark gray muscular large cat with a body shape and size like a jaguar, not like a mountain lion. The first sighting was from several hundred yards away down a gravel road. I was familiar with the area. I saw it at a nook inside the dense shrubs, which looked like a perfect animal den, and I saw this thing standing right near that. The next sighting was more unnerving. I was on an isolated ridge trail where you can just go one way in and the same way back out. About halfway along the ridge, I looked back and saw this same dark gray large cat. It was on the ridge I just passed. It was facing away from me, but checking things out to be safe. I exited the trail by bushwalking down a remote hill and took a cab all the way back to the park. I felt completely of sound mind, but looking back on it, it seems a little paranormal and strange. A wild cat, possibly an escaped pet. Any ideas? I don't know if you believe in any of the cryptids, but I do because of what I've seen. The other night, I was out riding backroads with a buddy, and we both saw something tan-colored with legs, kind of like a dog's hind legs, but taller, and instead of standing on all fours, it walked on 2 legs. It didn't look tall, but it was also gone so fast that after we spotted it, We couldn't see the face or anything. I live in Arkansas, if that helps. And if it also helps, it's around the Parks area. My brother lives outside of Greencastle in Indiana. His stepkids for years have reported a creature they would see at night. A large, thin, fox-like creature that would stand on its hind legs and stare at them from the end of the driveway, and would eventually just leave. When on its hind legs, it would stand over 4 feet tall. He always assumed they were seeing things until he saw it last night. It was as they described, but he also said it had very pronounced canines that he could see, and its hands weren't paws. They were long, thin, claw-like fingers. He said it looked like the hands of Count Orlok from Nosferatu. He said the height of it was at least 4 feet. In case you don't know, a South Asian Glowy is a large creature usually resembling a human, but always unusually fat and heavy. This one weighs a whopping 240 kilos. My first encounter with this potential dodo was when a girl, let's call her Sarah, was following me home every day. Other friends of mine complained about her following them and acting creepy, and later their whole personalities seemed to switch. From what I was told about doos growing up, they lock onto young males and eat them for energy. They then clone them, which causes the affected individuals to come back with different personalities. Am I in danger? There was an older man's spirit energy in my home growing up. The house was built in 1920, and he was a craftsman by trade. The house fell into disrepair, and while my mom did her best, he was never happy with us. His energy blocked doorways, and the house was set up so that you could walk in a complete circle. My bedroom was next to the kitchen on the right, in a small hallway to the bathroom, and my mom's bedroom, and the living room to the left. I would often have to walk all the way around the house to avoid the negative energy. It was like you hit a dark, invisible cloud of anger. Doors rattled, and lights would turn off and on. He stayed mostly in the basement, and I was terrified of it for years. I never saw him, but I felt him for years. We had a ghost cat, young lady, young boy with overalls. I did see many times in the older man energy. I believe all these energies over the years messed with my mental health and my mother's physical health. It's the real reason I sold the home that I paid off after my mom passed and left it to me. I went into therapy over the little boy ghost. My mom thought I was hallucinating and was concerned for my mental health. I saw ARS until I was about 8, the same age my grandpa passed away, and was able to see and feel energies. I'm almost 40 years old and don't have many experiences like that anymore. When it does happen, I'm usually able to handle it. When I left the house for the last time, I told the spirits not to follow me. They didn't. True story. A little boy drowned by my house, and I think his energy resonated with me, and he just really scared me because he had no eyes, just deep black sockets, and he screamed, but no noise would be heard. In 18 female and my friend, 17 female, in India. We live in India and have traveled in auto rickshaws many times. As always, after hanging out for a while, we get into a rickshaw to go home. The driver was talking a lot, and I didn't think it was creepy at first. He seemed to be around his late 30s or early 40s. He was asking us a lot of questions about whether we are college students, when our college was starting, stuff like that. It was weird how many questions he was asking, but I just thought that he must be a talkative driver. I noticed that he was looking at me through the mirror a lot. I thought that was creepy. My friend got off first. After she left, the driver started to tell me that I look pretty and like a heroine in a movie. I don't speak the language of the Indian state that I live in, so he started asking questions about my family and where I'm from. He asked whether I live alone or in a hostel. My phone was dead, and he heard me say that to my friend, so I don't think I could have acted as if I was on a call. I was starting to get anxious, so I didn't know what to do. He dropped me in front of my house, and he kept touching my hand unnecessarily when I was handing him the money. He was staring at me and was extremely close. I paid him and was getting off the rickshaw, and he told me again that I looked like an actress, Alabat, who is 31 years old. He gave me his hand, asking for a handshake, and I was getting anxious and didn't think before I shook his hand. He said bye, which was weird because I've traveled in rickshaws many times, and they never say bye, and added, "See you later." I'm not sure what he meant by that. He seemed pretty fluent in English. He was probably just saying bye and didn't mean anything, but I can't shake off the creepy feeling I got because of that. Am I just overreacting, or was it really weird? Family reunion in Florida. I was invited to a huge family reunion in Florida, and weirdly enough, we were supposed to wear name tags to identify ourselves, but I went with it. There was going to be a lot of distant cousins, and the idea was to wear name tags to make it easier for everyone to know who's who. I stopped at a grocery store to pick up some ice cream for the reunion. I was sitting in my car, texting for a moment, when I noticed suddenly that it looked like someone was blocking the sun. I looked up and might as well have jumped out of my skin due to shock. A man in his 50s or 60s was putting his tongue on my windshield. Well, I'm not sure how he was able to see my name tag. He grinned and asked, "Is your name? I mean name." I didn't really answer. I just nodded and quickly thought of something to say. I said I was just leaving. Then he asked me, "Where are you going?" So I said, "I'm going to a different store nearby because they didn't have the ice cream I was looking for." He said, "Okay," and then just walked away. As stupid as this sounds, I decided to drive away and go to a different store nearby because my nerves were rattled. I honestly think what happened was pretty funny in hindsight, but I felt terrified when it was actually happening. Shopping store encounter. I don't know if this will bring me any peace of mind, but I definitely need to get it off my chest. I had plans to meet up with family after they got off work, and I didn't want to stay cooped up in the house until then. So I went to a store that was halfway between our meeting spot. I'd rather not give out my actual location. I started off in the men's athletic section to look for things for my husband, and then went to the women's section. As I walked over to the t-shirt rack, a lady, late 20s or early 30s, approached me and asked if I would participate in a survey she was conducting about joy. I was skeptical, but I agreed. About halfway through, I noticed she never bothered to write anything down or attempt to record anything I was telling her. The questions revolved around faith and if I believed in God, or if I would want to work more on my belief in Him. I tried to keep things as short and simple as possible without giving too much information about myself to a stranger. She ended up thanking me for my time and then walked away. I want to note that she had nothing in her hands, so she wasn't doing any type of shopping. Plus, doing a survey like that in the middle of a store seemed a little off. Once I came to my senses, I walked around the store to see if I could find her. As I was walking, I noticed a super tall man just staring at the shoes for men. He wasn't picking anything up, literally just staring. He's a notable character. I ended up seeing her in the dress aisle, so I rushed over to the register to pay for what I had. I did notice while I was in line that she was talking to another woman, and the tall man walked over to the worker wearing the loss prevention vest, asked something, and then went to the back of the store. When I got up to the register, I informed the cashier about my encounter, and she asked me to describe the lady I had come in contact with. She told me she'd let someone know about it, and thanked me as I walked out the door. The same tall man walked out with me, no bags or anything in his hands. I immediately turned back around and walked right back into the store. I again shared my story with a loss prevention worker and asked if he or someone could walk me to my car. I don't think he was allowed to leave his post because he told me I'd have to wait for someone. Thankfully, another worker walked in, and he asked her if she was early for her shift, to which she said yes. She ended up walking me to my car, and I told her my story. She watched me get into my car, and I told her my story. I immediately locked the doors behind me and took off. I drove for about 10 minutes, went into a random neighborhood, and thankfully no one was following me. All of this could have definitely been nothing, just me overthinking it. But with the way the world is, I didn't want to take any chances. Hiking in Yosemite National Park. I laced up my hiking boots, ready for another adventure in Yosemite National Park. As an avid hiker from Arizona, I couldn't resist the allure of the park's breathtaking landscapes. Joining me was my friend from Texas, equally enthusiastic about exploring the beauty of nature. We embarked on a secure trail, basking in the tranquility of the surroundings. The crisp mountain air rejuvenated our spirits as we engaged in lively conversation, exchanging stories and admiring the scenery along the way. We encountered fellow hikers and campers, forming brief connections with like-minded adventurers. As we continued along the path, absorbed in our friendly banter, a peculiar sound broke through the calm. It was akin to a coyote's howl, but with an unnerving thickness that sent a shiver down my spine. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to investigate the source of the sound. Straying from the familiar trail, venturing deeper into the woods, the air grew dense with mystery. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy above, casting an eerie glow on our surroundings. The sense of being lost in the heart of use heightened our senses, making us acutely aware of every rustle and hushed whisper of the forest. Then my eyes widened with disbelief as I caught a glimpse of movement amidst the shadows. It stood tall, towering at about 8 feet, its body adorned in a dark gray hue with a hint of brown. Its appearance was both majestic and unsettling, a shaggy mane reminiscent of a male lion encircling its head, while the hair on its body and legs was shorter and more coarse. To my astonishment, it moved with an unnatural grace, walking upright on its hind legs. A mix of awe and curiosity consumed us as we cautiously approached the enigmatic creature, determined to capture evidence of this astonishing encounter. We reached for our cameras. However, the creature sensed our presence and, with a sudden burst of speed, disappeared into the depths of the forest, leaving us in awe and disappointment. Pulling up the photo on the camera's screen, our hopes were dashed as we were met with a blurry image. The creature's form eluded our capture, leaving only a vague impression of its magnificence. Yet, despite the blurred evidence, our hearts were filled with the thrill of witnessing something truly extraordinary. With a tinge of regret, we retraced our steps and found our way back to the secure trail. The disappointment of the missed opportunity lingered, but the memories of that encounter, however fleeting, would forever be etched in our minds. As we emerged from the woods, the familiar sights and sounds of the park greeted us, providing solace and a sense of familiarity. Use, with its grandeur and mysteries, had shown us a glimpse of the unknown, reminding us that the natural world still held secrets that could captivate and challenge our understanding. With a renewed appreciation for the wonders of nature, we continued our hike, cherishing the journey, the stories we shared, and the boundless possibilities that lie ahead in our adventures in the wilderness. Touring the redwoods in California. I was with a group touring the redwoods in California. The path split. One stayed at floor level, the other cut up onto a mountain and brought you about halfway up the trees. The tour was full of older people, so they all stayed on the floor level, but I absolutely had to go up on the mountain path by myself, just soaking in the gorgeous scenery, listening to chipmunk squirrels jumping and climbing trees, birds chirping, smelling that earthy air, admiring how high I was, how tall the trees still towered above me, and focusing on getting good shots with my camera. Suddenly, I froze. Something wasn't right. I realized it was completely silent around me. The only thing I could hear was my own breath and the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, the sound that a predator was in the vicinity. I looked down, but I was too high to see the lower trail. There really wasn't anything I could do. I stowed my camera in my bag and quickly, without running so as to enable a chase, continued down the trail. The sounds I could hear in the distance silenced as I drew nearer. I was terrified. I always knew hiking alone leads to the possibility of animal mauling. I'm a realist, but in that moment, I just wasn't ready to die. Suddenly, birds started immediately singing around me, and I could hear kids laughing and parents yelling at them to slow down. I turned and saw 3 young boys running up the rocks. I think their sudden loud presence startled whatever it was that was nearby, most likely some sort of mountain cat. I have never felt a greater sense of relief rush over me in my entire life, including the almost car accidents I avoided. I remember rejoining the group, blood still pumping from adrenaline. I remember snippets of the gift shop. The other people all asked me how the view was, and if I saw anything good. I remember saying the view was great, and there was lots of little wildlife. But inside, I was still a mess. I didn't want to say what had happened. The rest of that tour is a blur. I just couldn't focus. I remember everything I saw before that, but only random bits and pieces of after. Weird how something like that affects you. Fishing with Dad and brother. Let me tell you about my next story. This one's nowhere near as hair-raising as the other one. But hey, here it goes. This one is from many years ago. From when I was a preteen, early teens. I was fishing with my dad and brother on Dad's bass boat on a lake in Kentucky. We were night fishing for largemouth bass and had a decent night so far. Well, I get the usual tap-tap, so I set the hook hard. Though I was hung up, Dad takes the rod to see if he can get it loose. When it starts moving, he hands the rod back, thinking I've got a large cat or maybe a possible lake record bass. So here I am in a stalemate with something big on the other end. I would gain a little line. It would strip it back off. This goes on for about 10 minutes, although for me, it seemed like an eternity. When I finally get the edge, and whatever it is coming up, I get it to the surface, and Dad yells out, "Cut the line." Now I asked him why, and he refused. When he made out what it was, he had sworn I had hooked a body, when in turn, it was a very large snapping turtle. The turtle bit my jig, and I had managed to set the hook in the turtle's fleshy part of the mouth. Camping in Alabama. Mysterious aircraft. One night, when we were out camping in Alabama, we saw an aircraft hanging over us. We weren't all that far from Montgomery, so we figured it was just a helicopter or something. The only problem was, it didn't make any noise. There was no alcohol or drugs involved during our trip, so everyone was sober. My cousin got the idea to call his dad, who worked for the Air Force. My uncle was up in the control tower checking radars, and he said there was a blip, but there was no flight information about it. The aircraft slowly started to move over us, and we still heard no noise. There was only a breezy downdraft from it. My uncle called us back and said they were launching 2 fighter jets to check it out. By this time, the strange aircraft moved away, and we could just barely see the lights through the trees. Maybe 3 minutes later, the jets flew over a couple of times. When we got home, my uncle said that he never saw anything out there, and the ship disappeared from their radars by the time the jets were in flight. Driving home from dinner with my ex-wife. We took an off-road path by accident because I made a wrong turn. Figured I'd keep going because we were heading east, and that was our destination. A creepy dark road with some cornfields on the sides. Suddenly, my ex-wife says, "What's that?" Me. "What her?" "They're up ahead on the side of the road. Is that a person?" Now I have perfectly fine eyes, and so did she, but I didn't see a damn thing. Me. "I don't see anything." At this point, she turns to me looking angry and says, "Stop messing with me. Look at me." Irritated, "I don't see a thing." She looked at me confused and horrified, like I've never seen her before, and then looks back at the figure and says, "WTF, it's a man with a briefcase and a hat." Now I got a bit worried since the look on her face was way too genuine and spooky to be a stupid prank. So we get closer, and I still don't see a thing. She turned quiet as her head started turning as we came up to this man I did not see. So I stick my neck out and turn the bigger lights in the car on and off to see what the hell she was seeing. Nothing. I see absolutely nothing but corn in her road. So we passed by this man. She turns white and starts whimpering, and she basically begs me, "Please tell me you saw that. I'm freaking out. Please, please." Again, I tell her, calm down. I really didn't see anything. What is wrong with you? Then I peeked next to her to view my mirror, and I don't know how or why or whatever, but there he was for just half a second. I saw a man standing at the side of the road, all in black, and a hat on. I couldn't see the briefcase, but I am 100% sure I saw him standing there, looking at me through the mirror as he went out of the mirror's reflection. So I froze for a second, and then quickly looked out the back window. Nothing. My ex-wife knew I saw it too. OMG, you just saw it too. I told you I saw it. Please drive, go. We went home, and I haven't stopped thinking about that day ever. I'm not religious, and I don't believe in the paranormal or superstitious stuff. But for the life of me, I cannot explain how my ex-wife saw this person for a good 20 seconds, and I did not until I passed by and saw his reflection in the mirror while he was illuminated from my taillights. We spoke about it when we got home and tried finding explanations, but really, we never understood why a man who looked like he was in a black suit, a black hat, and had a black briefcase was doing on a dark, lonely road like that in 3 degrees C on a December night, backpacking in the Marble Mountains of California. At 22:30, I was out backpacking with a couple of friends in the Marble Mountains of California. We were out on this trail, maybe 25 or 30 miles from the nearest road. We'd hiked up this lake on the saddleback of a mountain, had a small glacier snowpack, and water falling into the lake. Seriously beautiful country. So most nights, I spent what little light I had reading Dreamcatcher by Stephen King, and we went out on day hikes for several days. So the last full day we were there, we were out on this trail in the countryside, and the freeze-dried meals finally caught up to me. I hoofed it off the trail, dug a hole at the foot of this giant pine tree, and put my back against the tree to do my business. I'm facing the hillside, and about 50 feet above me up the hill is a rocky outcrop. As I'm there with my pants at my ankles, I'm watching this small black critter of some kind, or at least I thought it was. A small black critter kind of shuffle back and forth. I'm kind of dumbfounded by this thing. Its proportions are seemingly all messed up. Huge eyes, and tiny, almost minuscule ears, and I can't see any feet. Suddenly, the giant jet-black glossy eyes meet mine, and it stands up. I realized the proportions weren't messed up. I was only looking at what was, whatever, this thing's head. It's incredibly thin and just as black, weasel-like, but at least 5 feet long and standing motionless with its eyes locked on my own. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity staring into Stephen King's ship weasels. I was startled by the sound of a ship hitting the ground at my feet. Yes, my own. __. Scared me. I looked back at the rocks, and it was gone. I didn't even wipe. I yanked my pants up and sprinted back down to the trail, white as a sheep. My buddies kept asking what was up, but I didn't want to sound like a lunatic. Eventually, I did tell them what I saw around the fire that night. My bud Luke said it may have been a fisher, a massive weasel-like thing. Todd thought he'd heard that a breeding pair of wolverines had been spotted in the area. I'm sure it was one of those things, but for that brief moment in time, Stephen King's ship weasels invaded my world. I never hiked so fast on the way out. Four-wheeling in the northwest Kimberley region, Australia. Australia, deep desert, northwest Kimberley region. A week of four-wheeling around various and sunny interesting places, sacred sites by invitation, desert oases, and endless long red stretches of sand. Spin effects and loneliness in between. Northeast, and the guide decide after an afternoon of 42 degrees Celsius in devil dust it's time to sit camp. We get ourselves into a little bush river dry during our visit for the most part, but still a few pockets of water around. Decent swimming if you ignore the snakes. The stones have to be described. The Kimberley region is like one gigantic rusty piece of ancient scrap metal with blue minerals rich in endlessly old stones and rock formations peeking through the iron-leaden dust and sands around our dry riverbed. The most comfy flat spot, smooth and consistently sized pebbles, have gathered. River and desert and sun formed into very comfortable round smooth stones. It's better than the dust and spin, so I dig a little depression, chuck my sleeping bag in it, lay down, and proceed to watch the universe rise over Australia with my boots on. About an eternity of stars later, I'm in one of those desert sleep funks. Half awake, it's pretty dark by now, and I can't really see well. Anyway, dusty eyelashes kind of glued shut. I'm snoozing when suddenly, about a meter away from me, I hear a very loud talk, something very alien. And yeah, I'm wide awake. I look over but I don't see anything. I cast a glance over to my mate, but he is fast asleep, snoring into the dust. I look back and again, nothing, thinking I must have just been lucid dreaming. I try to snuggle a bit deeper into the river stones, close my eyes, and try for some more of it. About a minute later, another huge talk, super loud. And this time, I'm up and on my feet. Still, there's nothing there, just me and Sleeping Beauty in the big wide desert. Okay, that was enough for me. I went and slept in the car, which is nasty in that region. So as I get up and get ready for breakfast, my guide comes over already freshly pissed and ready for action, and tells me we were visited last night by the owners of this land, and they gave us permission to stay here as long as we want because they reckon you're a dancer. I swear, though, there was nothing there. I looked and looked. Well, we stayed, and I got into my second night into the holes in the river stone. A lot less freaked out about the TOs, since it was just the owners giving us permission, and all that again. Though I get through the night, and about halfway through wake up, I look over to the spot I reckon I'd heard the talk just for grins, and this time there is a huge looming mass, darker than the spots in the night sky furthest from the stars, just a few meters away. I can make out no shape, no discernible figure. By this time, I have the idea in my head that I'm just dreaming again, so I try to sleep, and I do. About a few snores later, I wake up again and have another look. It was camels. Also come to sleep on the comfy riverbed. So my friend's uncle owns a plot of land, 10+ acres, and everything beyond that is ocean. It's actually a pretty cool hike from forest to beach. Anyways, he was taking his little cousin for a little camping trip off the land, meaning they made debris shelters and slept in them. Well, they would have. But about 3 hours after my friend goes to sleep, having put the cousin to bed, he hears the growl and rustling. He at the time wasn't quite sure what it was, so he grabs his headlamp or flashlight. Don't remember which. In this little dinky .22R, I think is what he said it was. I am not a gun guy. He walks up to the trail they used to get there, a little off trail in the bush, and hears this step and crunch of the stick. So of course, he turns his light on. However, its battery is pretty low, so not very bright. However, it's bright enough to see these two glowing orbs of light about a foot off the ground. He immediately figured out it's a mountain lion and freezes as it walks closer to him. He decided to try to scare it off once it got too close, so he tried to make noise to scare the lion by shouting and stomping. Well, that only made it angry, so he takes his .22 caliber and tries to shoot it into the dirt. It jams, of course. So he is struggling with it, and suddenly the lion just pushes past him, dead sprint into the night. My friend had an OS moment as the lion ran in the same way as camp, so he bucks it down to his cousin, picks the kid up, throws him over his shoulder, and runs a solid mile or so back to a barn where they spent the rest of the night. In the morning, they went back to get their gear, but my friend now brings something a little bigger, louder than a .22 caliber. Not sure what it is, but still, he was scared, and he doesn't scare easy. Trust me. Thanks for reading all of this if any of you did. I tend to ramble. Back in the 80s, my Aunt Kay was in her early 20s. This was before she married my uncle, and when she would drive long distances back and forth between her parents and my uncle's to visit. It was a transitional period for them. He had just graduated, and she hadn't moved up yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states through the desert. which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles, where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So Aunt Kay set out and began one of these journeys. A couple hours into the drive, Aunt Kay noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to Les Miserables until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into a rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she said she felt and heard as clear as day, "Don't pull over." Then again stronger, "Don't pull over." Call it God intuition or just a gut feeling, but a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through Aunt Kay's body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself, what the hell was that? As she saw the vehicle peel out behind her, the dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flashing their brights and motioning for her to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning? She felt it would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, especially before cell phones. But she pressed on. Just as her resolve wavered, she started questioning if she truly did feel what she felt. She started slowing back down when the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane and came level with Aunt Kay's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and yelled the words, "Pull over." Aunt Kay said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach and again heard the words in her head, "Don't pull over." She described him as looking scary and greasy and noticed he was missing a couple of teeth in his smile that she'll never forget. That sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thought she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her. She slowed down, he slowed down. She sped up, he sped up. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was to the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her alone out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aunt Kay saw a couple of semis off in the distance. She felt if only she could get close or even get in between those trucks, she would be safe, so she took off. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn, and try to hit her car until she got close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down and eventually disappear from view. She stayed with the trucks for a couple of hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Family fishing trip in Canada. About 8 years ago or so, I was around the age of 8. Me and my family were on our way back from a family fishing trip in the springtime. For reference, we live in Canada, and the place we drove to was about 2 hours away from any kind of civilization. So we're driving down the road when we see this hooded figure walking along in the field. As we drive by, we notice he was wearing the Grim Reaper hood, and he had the scythe, but you couldn't see his face. As we passed, he stopped and stared at us. Needless to say, we got heck out of there in a hurry. Encounter on I-15 near Barstow. Once, my mom and I were driving to Las Vegas from Santa Clarita. We were just passing Barstow on the I-15. It was right about high noon and very hot, no cloud in the sky. She had a fancy Lexus at the time with a touchscreen console on the day that could play DVDs while driving. I remember we were on a long stretch of road with a lot of space between cars on the highway. 1 minute, we see nothing ahead of us, and then all of a sudden, a woman was walking across the highway right in front of our vehicle. My mom swerved behind her and barely missed her. She pulled off to the shoulder, and we looked behind us and saw her go all the way across the highway, including westbound traffic. Then she turned around and walked all the way across again, each time nearly getting clipped by an unsuspecting and oncoming car like ourselves. At one point, a semi-truck almost hit her head-on, missing her by literally one step. Each step she took was a steady and confident step, looking ahead of her and never batting an eye to any oncoming traffic. She was barefoot, mind you, and walking on the boiling asphalt with zero sense of urgency. So my mom calls 911. We're directed to Highway Patrol. They say they received numerous reports, and they're headed out to it. My mom decided, after hanging up, to slowly reverse down the shoulder to get a better look and see if she's okay. Yes, I know, stupid in more than one way. As we get to a spot behind her, now she's crossed the highway and is now in front of our vehicle. This part I will never forget. The woman slowly turned her head and looks at us, and is now slowly but steadily walking towards our car. She was white as day in every way. White nightgown, pale dry wrinkled skin, white hair, and the palest bluish-gray eyes I've ever seen. Barefoot, almost looked like a Walking Dead version of Rose Dawson from Titanic. I was in the passenger seat, which was on the shoulder when my mom made eye contact. She froze, absolutely shut down. I remember the woman walking so close to my door. I could see her eyes make contact with mine. It looked as if she was blind and lifeless, but could not just see me, but see into and through me, like into my soul. I went cold immediately. She reached for my door handle, and I remember screaming at my mom to punch the gas. Without hesitation, she came to quick, and we peeled out of there. In the back window, I saw her watch speed off and then continue across the road again a mile down the highway. We called Highway Patrol to see what happened, and they didn't have a clue what we were talking about and said they got no reports of a woman crossing the highway. My mom to this day still doesn't remember the time between when we reversed to when we dipped out. I have no idea what happened that day except for what I witnessed. Family friend Dino and his final days. When I was younger, we had this family friend named Joe. We called him Dino. He was awesome, like one of those uncles who would spoil the __ out of you. He became sick one day and passed away when I was at school, maybe in grade 5 or 6, so I didn't really know what was going on at the time. He was diabetic, like my dad, but Joe's was worse. One of the last times I saw him was at my parents' place. I just got home from school. He was pale and seemed drowsy, silent. My dad told me he was sick and that he had something for me. It was a $5 bill before I got home and started to become aware of Joe's condition. My dad told me that he was seeing people that weren't there, like people that have already passed away, loved ones just standing around in the living room. His condition grew dire. He couldn't leave his house or even get up to leave his bed, but his wife Naomi was taking good care of him. She had told us a story about a few nights before his death. They had a horrifying experience. She gets ready for bed and falls asleep next to her husband. She eventually wakes up to someone screaming her name. The bed is empty. Naomi realizes that the screaming is coming from the front door in Joe's voice. He is shouting the words, "Naomi, get the F out here and see this." She jumps out of the bed as fast as she could and races towards the front door. As she's halfway, she can hear a glass smash followed by these loud, heavy footsteps stomping off and down the front steps. She approaches the door, and Joe is shaking with this shocked expression, pointing off into the darkness. Naomi sees this shadowy figure bolting fast into the field not too far from their house. She was chilled to the bone but was able to bring her husband back inside. It was peculiar. Joe was incapable of leaving his own bed, but was able to somehow, in the middle of the night, make it to the front porch with a glass of water for fresh air, where he was met by whatever that thing was. He never told anyone what he had seen. The scary thing is, he passed away while standing in the same exact spot. Childhood encounter with Cotton Head. I am a 41-year-old woman, but I remember vividly when I was 4. My little brother and I shared a room with twin beds. I recall well, his bed sheets were Star Wars while mine were rainbow bright, just setting the stage a little. Our beds were parallel to each other, facing a long and tall closet that was somewhat shallow. The door to the bedroom was to the left of the closet. I was lying in bed playing with my strawberry shortcake doll when I heard the muffled whimper of my 3-year-old brother on his bed to my right. Gang, the protective mother hen that I was, without looking over to him, asked him what was wrong. He answered me with a soft sob. I remember putting down my doll and starting to walk over to him. As I was closing the gap between us, about halfway there, he points towards the closet. He hid his face and started to sob hysterically. I remember stopping and following his tiny pointing finger with my eyes. What I saw still gives me the chills to this day. In our closet was what I can only describe as an extremely tall void of darkness in the shape of a man. He was well over 6 feet tall and seemed to be wearing a trench coat of some kind that went past his knees. He had what looked like an old-time Western hat that was small but rounded. Mind you, there were no details, only the outline. But his face, where the eyes and mouth would be, there were swirling colors of, well, like energy or heat waves or something. I honestly don't know how else to describe it. His mouth, or the colorful energy swirls where the mouth would be, was open wide, as if he were screaming at us at the top of his lungs, yet we heard no sound. Now thinking back, we had a shelf in the top of that closet, but he was standing through it. There was no possible other way. But this was not the scary one. On the floor next to this being's right knee, crouched down, was another creature. When I saw this creature, I released everything that was in my bladder. I just peed all over myself. I was terrified to the point of paralysis, yet I was standing stuck, frozen in terror, wet from urine in the middle of our bedroom. It looked like it was about to take off in a race. It was on all fours and looked like it was about to start running straight at me. It too was in the shape of a man, yet smaller and more animalistic. It was as if the taller man was holding it back, like he was walking a dog. Almost. My mother and father must have heard my brother's screams. I couldn't make a sound at that time. I remember them picking one of us up each to soothe our cries. You better believe once I could, my lungs let loose of the most horrific and blood-curdling scream. By that time, I was in full panic mode and unable to describe what we had witnessed. My father was holding me. I can still remember the smell of his gold leather jacket. It was the early 80s, and he was a biker. His back was facing the closet. I thought he was there to save me, but when I looked up over his shoulder, I could still see the tall man with the colorful eyes and screaming mouth. I tried to show them. We tried to show them, but neither of our parents could see them. My dad slept in the room with us that night because we refused to sleep without him. A couple of years later, in a whole other state away, that same man, minus the colorful eyes and mouth, terrorized me for a good couple of years. This time, he was made of total darkness. He was always there, it seemed, standing in the corner of my room watching me in bed or gliding down the hallway past my door, turning its head to look at me as it passed, peeking around my doorway, but as if it was laying on the ceiling, its head and hat poking around the top left-hand side of the door before slowly sliding back. I was honestly traumatized, to tell you the truth. I would have terrifying nightmares that I truly 100% believe this being caused. Night terrors is more like it. For example, one of those night terrors was of him sticking a meat hook through my sister and hanging her on our bathroom door. I also dreamed of these little hooded beings coming out of a hole under a giant live oak in our backyard and catching cats to eat them. My childhood was terrifying, to say the least. Disclaimer: I was never allowed to watch anything but cartoons and things like Fraggle Rock, so I was not influenced in any way that I can recall. No one believed me but my brother. I know this seems weird and random, but I named the man Cottonhead. I'm not sure why, but every night I would cry and beg my dad not to put me to bed because Cottonhead would come, and every night he would tell me, "It's just a dream." Exploring an alleged facility in New England, I was intrigued when my buddies proposed the idea of spending part of our leave in a remote part of New England, exploring an alleged facility that did not exist on record. The story we had heard was that this place housed an individual with some kind of special intuition that was invaluable to the military and intelligence. The whole place was shrouded in secrecy, with only a small team of guards and caretakers for the lone occupant. We decided to dress up as hunters and pretend to be pursuing some game in the area, just in case we got apprehended by the facility. We had already shot some game the day before, and then a white part of these woods to make our story more convincing. As the sun started to set, we carefully crept through the woods, using binoculars to scout the area ahead. We caught a glimpse of a man outside pacing around in an enclosed area. He came in and out of view 4 or 5 times, as the security fence blocked the rest of our view. The person who told us about the facility had warned us that the occupant was unstable and would often start screaming and yelling, requiring restraint. We were nervous but curious about what we might find inside. As we got closer to the facility, we could hear strange noises and see flickers of light coming from within. Our hearts were pounding as we approached the entrance, but we were determined to see what was inside. We cautiously made our way through the facility, avoiding guards and security cameras as best we could. We soon found ourselves in a room where the individual was being kept. He looked thin and frail, and there was something strange about his eyes. Suddenly, the man started to scream and thrash around, breaking free from his restraints. The guards rushed in to subdue him, but he was stronger than we expected. We knew we had to leave before we were caught. We quickly made our way back through the facility, dodging guards and security cameras as best we could. As we emerged from the woods, we realized that we had been in there for much longer than we had intended. We had to hurry to make it back to base before our leave was over. Despite the danger and uncertainty we faced, we felt like we had accomplished something by exploring the hidden facility. We had uncovered a secret that few others knew about, and we felt like we had made a real difference in our mission. Looking back on that experience, I realized that we had been lucky to make it out of there unscathed. It was a lesson that we would carry with us for the rest of our military careers. Night watchman at the cemetery. Before my current job, I had a series of odd jobs, one of which was as the night watchman at a cemetery. The cemetery was very old and notoriously haunted, but both of my grandmother's aunt and grandfather were buried there, so that gave me a sense of ease. Part of my job was to lock the front gate, then to drive throughout the cemetery and notify all visitors that we were closing and that they had to start getting ready to leave. Then I'd let them all out through the gate when I was done. While driving along a section of graves, I noticed an older woman walking along the path very slowly. She was in my sight for over 100 yards, so I pulled up in my car, got out, took my eyes off of her for a moment, and walked around the car. When I looked up, she was gone, vanished into thin air. I looked all over the area, and there was absolutely no one in sight. It was unbelievable. Later that night, when my wife came to visit and bring me dinner, I noticed her grab her hair and look around. I asked, "What's wrong?" She said, "Nothing." It felt like my hair got caught in a branch. So I said, "Babe, look around. The closest tree is 50 feet away." She insisted that she felt almost like a hand run its fingers through the top of her hair and pull on her ponytail. That's when I mentioned my experience about the old lady from earlier in the evening, and we both were stunned. That was when I told the cemetery I would finish out the week and wouldn't be coming back. Poltergeist encounter in upstate New York. The following happened in my home and involved both my sister and myself when we were very young. It was nighttime, around 9 or 10 o'clock p.m. We lived in upstate New York towards the mountains, so it was always very quiet and isolated. To lay out ground zero for you, picture a dead-end hallway, 20 feet long, with 3 rooms leading off from it. 2 smaller ones on the left, 1 large one on the right. My sister, who occupied the larger room, was just getting into bed. She had just called for my dad to come say good night when the air turned freakishly cold, the kind that stings your eyes and makes you cough when you breathe it in. the kind necessary for turning soap bubbles into glassy orbs in the dead of winter. I remember watching for my bed as it emerged from the upper hallway, creeping horizontally on the wall. It was facing into my sister's room, its back to me, slowly coming into her view as a ghostly white arm dragged it along the side of the wall, as if gravity had shifted sideways. In the Pacific area, I remember shouting for my sister, which alarmed her enough to shriek. Whatever it was heard me and twisted its head around nearly 180 degrees to stare into my soul. It had these huge, hollow, and bottomless black eyes, and a mouth which was twisted into something akin to a carnival mask's creepy smile to match. If you've ever felt that something could kill you with just a stare, this was it. As soon as my father rushed the hallway, it vanished from sight. However, the presence did not. My parents camped out in our rooms for hours, yet the sinister cold held fast. I have seen innumerable paranormal events, living up in the mountains on a seventh-generation farm, but nothing I've ever been through can compete with what happened that night. There were 4 witnesses in all, 2 kids who saw it, and 2 adults who felt it. There was no precursor to its visit other than roughly 3 seconds of cold. No other warnings, no other sand, no random freaky glitches in the matrix. Suddenly, it was just there. In all honesty, that's the most terrifying aspect of it all. After it supposedly left, the cold cleared on its own, and though the thermometers gave normal readings, it must have taken hours to feel like room temperature again. Sleep talking and paranormal recording. I've always been told that I tend to sleep talk, but I never really believed it until my roommate complained about my constant chatter. Intrigued and a bit embarrassed, I decided to download an app to record my sleep talking, hoping to finally understand what I was saying during the night. I set up the app on my phone and placed it on my nightstand before going to bed. I must admit, I was both curious and nervous about what I might hear the next morning. My sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams and a feeling of unease. When I woke up, I hesitated for a moment before reaching for my phone. The app showed several recordings from throughout the night. I played the first one, and there I was, mumbling incoherently about some nonsense. I chuckled to myself, relieved that it was just harmless gibberish. But then I played the next recording, and to my surprise, I heard a deep male voice speaking from what sounded like the other end of the room. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. The voice was unfamiliar, and there was no way someone else could have been in my room. I live alone, and I always lock my doors and windows before going to bed. The voice in the recording was unnerving, speaking in a tone that sounded both menacing and oddly calm. I couldn't understand what the man was saying, but it felt like he was speaking directly at me, almost as if he was taunting me. I played the recording again and again, trying to figure out if there was some sort of logical explanation for it, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with a rational reason for the voice. There was no one else in my apartment, and the voice was definitely not mine. Encounter with Wendigos in the Pacific Northwest. I'm Joe, a seasoned hunter and guide who has spent my entire life in the great outdoors of the Pacific Northwest. I've heard many tales of Wendigos, but never saw one myself until that rainy day in November of 1995. I was camping with a few friends in a remote area near the Oregon-Washington border. We were sitting around the fire, trying to stay warm and dry when we noticed a strange figure standing next to a tree. At first, we thought it was a dog, but as it got closer, we realized it was something else entirely. The creature was about 6.2 feet tall with giant antlers and muscular shoulders. It looked like a bipedal dog. Its head was not pony-like, as some of the stories we had heard, but more human-like. It didn't move at all, just stared at us curiously. Mark, one of my friends, got up and approached the creature. As he got closer, it turned and walked away, slowly disappearing into the dense forest. We were all stunned, not sure what to make of what we had just seen. Later that evening, we talked about it and tried to come up with an explanation. We knew that there were stories of Wendigos in the area, but seeing one in person was a different experience entirely. The next day, we heard about a man named Chad who was known to leave food out for the creatures in the area. We decided to pay him a visit and see if he had any insight into what we had seen. Chad was a Native American man who had lived in the area for most of his life. He told us about his encounters with wendigos and how he believed they were peaceful creatures who just wanted to be left alone. After talking with Chad, we decided to do some investigating of our own. We spent several days in the area looking for any signs of wendigos. We didn't find anything conclusive, but we did hear strange noises and saw footprints that could have belonged to the creature. To this day, I'm still not sure what we saw that day in November. Owen's investigation of Tony C's sighting. My name is John, and I work for the local newspaper in Oregon City. I was intrigued when I received a strange phone call from a man named Tony C, claiming to have seen something unusual up in Olin. He spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid someone might be listening in on the conversation. Tony claimed that he and his friends had come across a family of creatures, and that they were unlike anything he had ever seen before. He didn't say the word Bigfoot, but the implication was clear. He offered to show me exactly where they were if I was interested. I tried calling Tony's number repeatedly, but there was no answer. Eventually, I decided to pass the information along to Peter Byrne, a renowned Bigfoot researcher. However, even he had no luck getting in touch with Tony. Days turned into weeks, and I had all but given up hope of ever learning more about Tony's encounter. But then one day, I received a call from a man named Steve Williams. Steve had spoken with Tony, and he was able to provide me with more details about the incident. It had occurred during bow hunting season in September of 1995. Tony and his friends had been biking in the Walls area when they came across a terrible smell, like something dead. Suddenly, a 10 to 12 feet tall dark creature ran past them, making so much noise that Tony thought there must be several more. 4 of them nearby. He hadn't taken a shot at the creature itself, but at a shadow that he thought might have been one of the creatures. At first, Tony's boss had laughed off the incident, but later suggested he report it. That's when Tony had called me. I was fascinated by Tony's story, especially since it involved the sighting in such close proximity to our town. I decided to dig deeper and eventually learned that there was a local Native American tribe in the area that had stories and legends about similar creatures. With this new information, I reached out to the tribe and was able to speak with an elder who had first-hand knowledge of these creatures. He confirmed that they were indeed a part of their traditional stories and that sightings had been reported by members of the tribe for many years. I knew that Tony's encounter might be met with skepticism by some, but I felt that it was important to share his story with our community. Who knows what else might be out there waiting to be discovered? Ranger's experience in Georgia Park. When I was younger, I worked as a ranger in Georgia Park. Most of my nights were spent instructing people not to leave out offerings for bears and other animals, but every now and again, I got a call about rowdy teens or even rowdier adults. It was thankless work, but dealing with the public often was. One night, I was leaning back in my chair, listening to a podcast, in a last-ditch effort to stay awake. The phone rang. Normally, I relished the action. The night shift was miserable without it, but it was 30 degrees out tonight. I had no registered campers. The last thing I wanted to do was leave the central heating of my post to go and hunt down a group of kids that ran off to make out in the woods. Frustrated long before I had the chance to say hello, I brought the phone to my ear, waiting for somebody to say something. However, no matter how I called to the other person, there was only heavy breathing in response. Nothing like a good old-fashioned prank call to make the hate of youth just a bit more than I already did. I hung up, resuming my podcast content to doze off until morning. The prank caller had other plans. They called 4 times, only ever breathing heavier into the receiver. By the 5th call, my patience was now at its end. I answered with a sharp, "What?" only to have it steamrolled by crying and begging a muddled voice. Very indecipherable. I don't remember how long I spent trying to calm her down before she finally choked something out. "By the river, please help." The line went dead because, why wouldn't it have? And then nobody else called. All efforts to call her back were met with a telltale ring of a busy signal. But by the river was too vague. The river stretched through most of the park. It would take hours to calm the area on my own. But when I realized it was my loan that was cut, I had no other choice. I grabbed my shotgun off the wall, hoping almost desperately that it was a bear taking a break from hibernation to hassle a woman for her peanut butter sandwich and not another psychopath. Hello? Is anybody out there? I stood on the doorstep with my ear to the wind, hoping to get some kind of clue for what direction to head off into. I was met with silence. I heaved a sigh of defeat and chose a direction at random. When I found her, I swore I'd give her a good old piece of my mind. Not only was it freezing, but the trails were pretty clear about getting near the river. They were endless deadly combinations lurking within their depths. Some said the dagger did not solely lie beneath the water. Some said that the gray woman walked along the banks crying out for help in an effort to lead compassionate bystanders into the water. A story I didn't necessarily believe. It was entertaining nevertheless. The stories my coworkers came up with never ceased to tickle me. I was about 30 minutes away from the ranger station when I stepped on something squelching beneath my boots. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but as I knelt down before the mass, I realized exactly what I was dealing with. Someone's wet clothes sat in a heap, discarded in a hurry in an effort to warm up after falling in. And the ice was rarely thick enough to bounce an acorn off, let alone pretend to be capable of holding a human's weight. So I can only wonder how anybody could have gotten so soaked, even if they'd slid down the bank. There was no way they'd been submerged the way these garments suggested that they had been. I'd been about to start searching for blood trails when a voice came from the other trees. It was nothing more than a hiss, but it sent my heart into overdrive either way. My first instinct was to haul it back, where I came from, to leave the whispers behind once and for all, but the shotgun in my hand was more than capable of turning a human into Swiss cheese, so I pushed forward. I called into the trees, demanding that the person hiding amongst the leafless branches come out with their hands up. When nothing happened, I called again, this time warning them that I'd shoot if they did not say something. Stop screaming. Shield. The voice from the trees didn't seem to understand the concept of packing heat. I could only wonder if she was in the throes of a psychotic break, and there was nothing else out there after all. Yet she was huddled amongst the vegetation, whimpering about some mysterious she. I was moments from threatening her with the cops when I heard the same voice from over the phone. It was just as hysterical as it had been, just as watery and hard to understand as it had been over the phone. If not for the icy hand on my wrist, I'd have followed the voice of the person I'd originally gone searching for. It was my job to help those in need on the trail, and I had no reason to hesitate. But the woman's hold was unbreakable in that moment, and her hiss warning to stay still made me think twice. I tried to help her. The woman told me her face was a breath away from my own, but she was as cold as the rocks along the river's edge. The heat that radiated from living beings was completely missing in her, but my attention went elsewhere as the voice called for help again. And if you don't want to end up like me, you'll go back the way you came. I have no idea what to account for. I can only assume this was the poltergeist of a woman who had passed 3 months ago. My wife and I decided to take a drive up Mary's Peak Road in Oregon. We were excited to explore the highest mountain in the state's Coast Range, towering at 4,097 feet. The weather was crisp and cool, with plenty of snow still covering the peak in mid-April. As we were coming down the mountain around 4:30 p.m., we spotted a beautiful waterfall surrounded by wildflowers. The sight was too enchanting to pass up, so we decided to stop and take in the view. I remember stepping out of the car, the chilly air nipping at my exposed skin, and feeling a sudden, inexplicable sensation. It was as if the hair on my neck stood on end. And for a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Just then, I heard a faint tink-tink on the ground, followed by a flash past the car window. Startled, I looked down and saw an old, rusty, dented blue 2B coffee can lying near us. It looked like it was from a brand I recognized, maybe Maxwell. If I had been standing outside at that moment, it would have hit me. The sudden impact and the strangeness of the object made my heart race with fear. Panicked, my wife and I immediately got back in the car and prepared to leave. As I glanced back towards the road, I caught a glimpse of a tall, blurry, reddish-brown figure standing about 200 feet away, just beyond the guardrail. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it just a tree, or could it have been something more? I've always been fascinated by the stories of Bigfoot and have read extensively about the elusive creature. Although I couldn't be sure, the figure I saw that day bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions I've come across in my research. I've heard accounts of Bigfoot throwing objects to scare away intruders, and the coffee can seem to fit the bill. I couldn't help but wonder if we had unintentionally stumbled upon its territory. We didn't stick around long enough to find out. The fear and uncertainty that gripped us in that moment were enough to send us on our way, leaving the mysterious figure and the unexplained coffee can behind. To this day, I can't say for certain what we encountered on Mary's Peak Road, but a part of me hopes that it was indeed a Bigfoot, reminding us that some things in this world are still left to be discovered. Park Ranger's encounter with a troll. I'd always been drawn to the quiet beauty of the hills near Silverton. As a park ranger, I was fortunate to spend my days surrounded by nature's splendor. I thought I knew the landscape like the back of my hand, but one incident would change my perspective forever. It started with a phone call from a distressed woman named Linda. She told me that her mother and sister had encountered something strange and terrifying near their home in the hills. She described it as a troll, a short, hairy creature that marched back and forth in front of their house. Her family was so frightened that they had fled to a motel for the night. Intrigued and concerned, I decided to investigate. I drove out to their house nestled in the heart of the hills and began my search. As I approached the property, a sense of unease washed over me. The air seemed heavy, as if the very atmosphere was warning me to turn back. I pressed on, stepping out of my vehicle and scanning the area for any signs of the mysterious creature. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, which made it difficult to discern any tracks or traces. As I walked around the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound coming from a nearby thicket. Heart pounding, I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the pepper spray attached to my belt. As I pulled back the branches, I was met with the sight of the creature Linda's family described. It was short, no more than 4 feet tall, and covered in coarse, matted hair. It stared at me with beady eyes that seemed to pierce my very soul. Then, without warning, it began to march back and forth, just as Linda's mother and sister had recounted. I stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief, as the creature continued its bizarre display. It seemed uninterested in me, focused solely on its repetitive marching. I knew I had to do something, but what could a park ranger like me do against such an unknown being? Gathering my courage, I shouted at the creature, hoping to scare it away. To my surprise, it stopped and looked at me, its eyes narrowing with curiosity. I took a step forward, my voice firm but shaky. "You need to leave this place. You're scaring the people who live here." The creature tilted its head as if considering my words, and then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened before hurrying back to my vehicle. This was a nest sighting, not an actual creature sighting. I was a member of an archaeology survey crew, and we had hiked in along an old overgrown logging RR grade on the side of Pelican Brook. This grade took off from an old closed logging road. We were approximately 1 mile from the end of the closed road when we found a very large nest on the ground, which measured about 7 feet in diameter. It was constructed of pine needles and small twigs. The nest material was about 8 to 12 feet in height, about 150 yards uphill from the old grade that we were following. The only reason we found it at all was because a crew member saw a spotted owl in a tree up the hill, and we went up to get a closer look. The owl flew up the hill a bit farther, and we followed, trying to catch a good glimpse of the owl, as most of us had never seen one in the wild. That's when we noticed the huge nest on the ground was the owl leading us there. All 6 crew members felt it was a Bigfoot nest. We reported it to the wildlife biologist back at the office, and he said there are some large birds that make nests on the ground, which can be up to 3 feet in diameter, such as cranes, but he's never heard of one that large. Also, cranes nest in meadows near water, not on the side of a mountain several miles from water. When we suggested a Bigfoot nest, he just shrugged and said maybe this was a very remote location and hadn't been logged in years, probably since the 1950s. We also discovered a very old logging camp archaeology site dating from the early 1900s, which had old glass bottles still intact, which was evidence that no one had been there in a very long time, as most other old sites in more accessible places had been looted for the glass bottles. Point being, this was an area where no one goes, so if this were a hoax, it's a terrible place to do it, as chances are no one is going to see it. Unfortunately, no one took a photo.